All right, we're about to dive deep into one of the most debated phrases in any religious scripture. It's a phrase that has really shaped how people see Islam and women for centuries. In this explainer, we're going to peel back all those layers of tradition to ask a really simple question. What if we've been reading it wrong this whole time? What if the text itself holds a completely different answer? وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ. Traditionally, this gets translated as "and strike them." And wow, this single phrase has been a flashpoint for centuries of debate. But here's the twist. What if the key to understanding it isn't buried in all that tradition, but in the language of the text itself? A whole new analysis suggests we might have been missing the point entirely. So you might be wondering, how did this one little phrase become so important? Well, for people on all sides of the conversation, critics and defenders alike, "Wadribuhunna" has basically been the go-to proof text for huge arguments about hierarchy, discipline, and a woman's place in a marriage. Historically, the common understanding is that this verse lays out a three-step process for a husband to correct a wife he thinks is being disobedient. But what if that entire idea rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of the original language? What if the problem the verse is trying to solve isn't disobedience at all? That is the core question we are about to dig into. The big idea behind this fresh reading is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly powerful. Let the Quran define its own words. So instead of relying on traditions or dictionaries written centuries later, this method says, hey, let's just see how the Quran itself uses a word consistently across the entire book. Think of it like this. The Quran becomes its own dictionary. The idea here is that the truest, most accurate meaning of a word isn't going to be found in a commentary written hundreds of years later, shaped by a different culture. No, it's found in the consistent way the word is used inside the original text. It's all about letting the book speak for itself. So how does this actually work? Well, it's a pretty clear, repeatable method. First, you pick a keyword, in this case, nujus, which is the thing that supposedly triggers this whole response. Then you track down every single time that word appears in the Quran. And finally, you figure out the core meaning that connects all of those different uses. So let's put it to the test. Okay, so before we can even talk about the command wadribuhana, we have to understand the problem it's meant to solve. And that problem is called nushuz. For centuries, it's been translated as disobedience, rebellion, or insubordination. But does the evidence inside the Quran actually back that up? This right here is the crucial question. If we just set tradition aside for a moment and look at the Quran's own internal dictionary, what does it tell us nushuz really is? Well, the answer is hiding in plain sight, just by tracking the root word. And the evidence is right here in the text itself. The root for nushuz is used to talk about bones rising up to reform a body. It's used to tell people at a gathering to rise up and move away. And get this, it's even used when a woman fears nushuz from her husband. In every single case, the consistent meaning is about a physical act, rising, separating, distancing. It's describing an action, not a moral failure. And you know, the Quranic language is incredibly precise. In another part, it actually pairs nushuz with another word, i'rad, which means turning away. And this comparison makes the meaning crystal clear. Nushuz is the external, physical act of pulling away. I'rad is the internal, emotional act of the heart turning away. One is a shift in your physical space. The other is a shift in your emotional connection. Totally different things. And this brings us to a huge realization. Nushuz isn't a moral crime like disobedience. It's a relational term for a very specific problem. One partner is physically creating distance in the marriage. And with that one insight, the entire foundation for a disciplinary reading just starts to crumble. Okay, but this raises a really big question, right? If the linguistic evidence points so clearly in this other direction, how on earth did the disciplinary interpretation become the dominant one for over 1,000 years? To get that, we have to take a quick look at how interpretations can evolve over time. This timeline really shows how an idea can harden into tradition. See, early on, commentators just read their own social norms into the text. Then the legal schools came along and basically codified that norm, calling it a husband's right. Fast forward a few centuries, and modern reformers started feeling the ethical pressure. They tried to soften the act, suggesting it was just symbolic, like a tap with a toothbrush. But they never questioned the underlying idea of discipline. It's only been very recently that scholars have gone back to the source and challenged what the words themselves actually mean. So let's bring it all back. If nushas means marital distancing, not disobedience, what does that do to the rest of the verse? Well, it completely transforms those three prescribed actions. They stop being punishments and turn into something else entirely. A guide for how to resolve conflict and find your way back to each other.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. Look at how this reframes the whole thing. Step 1, talk about the problem, directly and honestly. Step 2, create some space in the bed, not to punish, but as a clear, nonviolent signal that, hey, our connection is broken. And then step 3, wadribuhunna. The same root word for this action, daraba, is used in other parts of the Quran to mean to set forth a parable or to make a point clear. So in this view, it's not a violent blow, but a decisive physical gesture, like a touch on the shoulder or taking a hand, that's meant to break through that emotional wall and powerfully say, I want to reconnect. It's a sequenced toolkit for healing.
This one shift just flips the entire dynamic on its head. The verse goes from being a vertical model of authority and discipline to a horizontal model of partnership. It's no longer about a husband's power over a wife. It's about giving two people the tools to heal a relationship that started to drift apart. So why does all this matter today? Because the language we use to read these ancient texts literally builds the world we live in. By taking a second look at words we thought we knew, we can start to see those texts, and maybe our own world, in a completely new light.
At the end of the day, by simply going back to the text and letting it define its own terms, a verse that has so often been used to justify control becomes a roadmap for connection. The whole conversation shifts from power and obedience to intimacy and healing.
And that's what I want to leave you with. This was an explainer about one word in one verse, but it points to something so much bigger. What other assumptions have we baked into the translations we take for granted? And what new possibilities, what new worlds of understanding might open up if we just dared to look at the words again, as if it were for the very first time?